Imagine being a German intelligence officer in late 1943, still believing your army, the mighty Wehrmacht, holds the key to victory, or at least a stalemate in the greatest war the world had ever seen. Then, one cold November afternoon, you're handed a stack of captured American documents, routine logistics forms, nothing flashy, and what you read in those dry figures utterly shatters your world. That's precisely what happened to two senior German intelligence analysts, Colonel Reinhard Gehlen and Colonel Alexis von Röhrener. They weren't looking for grand battle plans. They were poring over mundane American supply charts, the kind of paper. But these two, with their keen analytical minds, saw something truly terrifying hidden within the columns of numbers and inventory lists. What they discovered wasn't just a slight advantage or even a significant edge, but a staggering, almost unbelievable disparity in industrial capacity. These documents revealed that the Americans were operating on a scale so massive, so overwhelming, that it completely rewrote every strategic assumption the German high command held about their ability to win the war or even meaningfully continue it. It was like suddenly discovering your opponent in a chess match has 10 queens while you're scrambling with just one. The raw material superiority laid bare in those routine forms showed that the war wasn't just being fought on battlefields anymore. It was being won or lost in the factories and shipyards thousands of miles away. This wasn't some whispered rumor or tactical blunder. It was concrete, undeniable proof that the war effort of the United States was simply astronomically. But how did the Germans get it so wrong? How could they have been so blind to this colossal force rising against them? Well, the seeds of their defeat were sown much earlier in a fundamental misunderstanding of All right, so Gehlen and von Röhrener are staring at these American documents, and what they're seeing isn't just bad, it's catastrophic. Imagine, for a moment, being a German logistics officer whose entire workday is meticulously counting every bullet, every liter of fuel, making agonizing choices about who gets what. Now these American forms land on your desk, and you see that a single US corps in Italy is receiving more fuel and ammunition than entire German army groups fighting on the vast Eastern Front. Think about that for a second. Entire German army groups facing off against the Soviets in brutal, grinding trench warfare, receiving less than one American corps. It's like comparing a garden hose to a fire hydrant. And it wasn't just raw tonnage. The documents showed details like American artillery firing at 7 times the German rate. 7 times. For German artillery officers, every shell was precious, carefully aimed, conserved for critical. The Americans, by contrast, were showering the battlefield with ordnance, often in casual barrages that the Germans would reserve for the most desperate moments of a major offensive. What really twisted the knife was the realization that this wasn't some special, unsustainable push for a specific battle. This astronomical rate of consumption, this overwhelming abundance of supplies, was listed as *normal operating procedure*. This wasn't a temporary surge. This was how they fought, day in and day out. It shattered the German strategic assumption that the Americans, despite their industrial capacity, would still face logistical bottlenecks, that their forces would eventually run out of steam, just like everyone else. Gehlen and von Röhrener understood then that this wasn't just a quantitative difference. It was a qualitative one, a fundamental shift in the very nature of warfare. Germany was fighting a war of scarcity, parsimony, and grim determination, while America was waging a war of overwhelming abundance, a deluge of steel and fire that simply couldn't be absorbed or countered. But this was only one part of the puzzle. The deeper problem lay in Germany's own colossal miscalculations about America's economic power, and that story begins even before the war officially started for the US. So how did German intelligence get it so wrong in the first place? Well, the problem wasn't just in underestimating American logistics during the war. It started much earlier with a fundamental, almost arrogant, misjudgment of America itself. Back in 1940, with war consuming Europe, President Franklin D. Roosevelt famously called for the production of 50,000 aircraft annually, 50,000 planes a year. When this news reached Berlin, German leadership, particularly people like Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, they dismissed it as pure propaganda, an absurd and impossible boast from a nation they viewed as soft, decadent, and utterly incapable of serious warfare. Their mindset was rooted in a simplistic worldview. America was good at making consumer goods, cars, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, but surely not war machines on that scale. They saw America as a land of jazz and Hollywood, not heavy industry. What they utterly failed to grasp, what was completely alien to their understanding of economics and national mobilization, was the sheer, untapped industrial muscle of the United States. Germany had been at max, but America was different. The Great Depression, a devastating decade for the American people, ironically left behind a colossal, dormant beast, massive idle industrial capacity. Think about it. Empty factories, skilled workers hungry for jobs, raw materials in abundance, all lying fallow. When the call came, America didn't have to build its war machine from scratch. It simply had to wake it up. Those car plants that were making sedans and trucks, they could be converted to build tanks and bombers. The Germans, with their tightly controlled, militarized economy that had been running hot for years, couldn't fathom such a rapid swing. They believed they were fighting an enemy constrained by the same limitations they faced. They were profoundly wrong. This wasn't just a miscalculation, it was a catastrophic failure of imagination, a failure to understand that America's economic weakness during the Depression would become its greatest wartime advantage. And this underestimation would have chilling consequences for German units facing the endless tide of American war materiel. Even while German high command was dismissing America's industrial might as mere propaganda, their own field commanders on the ground were getting a first-hand, terrifying glimpse of the truth. The North African campaign, particularly the early engagements like Kasserine Pass, saw American units suffer significant tactical defeats. They were green, fresh to combat, and made mistakes. German commanders, especially the legendary Erwin Rommel, initially reveled in these early victories, confirming their biases about American inexperience. But beneath that tactical victory, a deeply unsettling pattern emerged. Rommel, a brilliant and pragmatic strategist, couldn't ignore what he was seeing. American units, even after being badly mauled and suffering heavy losses that would cripple a German formation for weeks or even months, would simply reappear days later, fully re-equipped, with fresh tanks, new trucks, and complete ammunition stocks. Imagine the psychological blow to German soldiers who just fought tooth and nail to destroy an American column, only to see it replaced, as if by magic a few days later, often with Rommel himself noted, with a growing sense of alarm, the colossal quantities of material at the disposal of the American and British forces. His intelligence officers reported finding Allied supply dumps so vast, so overflowing with everything from spare parts to food, that they contained more material than entire German army groups could ever dream of accumulating. For the Afrika Korps, every drop of fuel, every recoilless rifle shell was a precious commodity, often ferried across the Med under constant threat. To see the Americans, still tactically green, operating with such profligate abundance was not just demoralizing. It was a stark, undeniable signal that they were fighting a different kind of war, against an enemy whose resource. Rommel knew that courage and tactical acumen could win battles, but they couldn't win a war against an opponent who could simply replace every loss 10 times over. This first-hand experience in the desert was the bitter prelude to the even more devastating intelligence reports that would land on Gehlen and von Röhrener's desks just months later, proving that Rommel's fears were not just justified, but understated. But the sheer scale of the Allied material advantage wasn't limited to what they delivered to the front lines. The manufacturing output itself delivered an even more stunning punch. Beyond the hard numbers and the alarming observations of field marshals, German intelligence had another crucial source: their own soldiers. After the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia in May 1943, the Allies captured an astonishing 125,000 German and Italian prisoners of war. Interrogating these POWs became a goldmine of information, and what they consistently reported reinforced the growing dread within German intelligence circles. These captured soldiers, many of whom had seen years of brutal combat, told stories that sounded utterly fantastical to their German interrogators, yet they were remarkably consistent. They spoke of American wastefulness that was almost unbelievable. Imagine a German soldier, likely on reduced rations for weeks, hearing tales of American GIs casually tossing out entire trays of uneaten, plentiful food, or seeing slightly damaged trucks and jeeps simply abandoned on the side of the road, rather than being painstakingly recovered and repaired. For a Wehrmacht that scrounged for every spare part and meticulously salvaged every piece of equipment, this apparent disregard for resources was mind-boggling. They also reported an abundance of personal gear, medical supplies, and even luxuries, chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, things German soldiers hadn't seen. These weren't just isolated anecdotes, they were corroborated across thousands of interrogations. The sheer volume of these subjective accounts painted a picture of an enemy swimming in resources. At first, some German officers might have dismissed these stories as exaggeration or propaganda from demoralized men. But then, as more and more objective evidence filtered in, like those captured American supply documents, these subjective accounts, the wastefulness wasn't personal extravagance. It was simply standard operating procedure for an army that had so much. It was often more efficient to replace than repair, to discard than conserve. It was the logical outcome of a production machine designed not for scarcity, but for overwhelming abundance. And this realization, born from the lips of their own defeated soldiers and cemented by cold, hard data, would further solidify the grim conclusions being drawn by analysts like Galen and von Röhner. But if the frontline abundance was terrifying, the numbers showing the overall production disparity were truly staggering. So if the desert observations and POW accounts painted a disturbing picture, the raw production statistics were absolutely horrifying for German intelligence. By 1943, the numbers weren't just concerning. They indicated an industrial chasm so vast it defied tactical solutions. Let's look at tanks, the spearhead of the Blitzkrieg. In 1943, Germany, at its peak output, managed to produce 11,600 tanks. Well, in that same year, America rolled out a staggering 37,198 tanks. That's more than triple Germany's output. More shockingly, a single Chrysler tank factory, designed with innovative automotive assembly line methods, often produced more tanks than Germany's entire national production. While German tank manufacturing still held onto more traditional, almost artisanal techniques for quality and customization, the Americans perfected mass production, churning out Shermans and other armored vehicles at a relentless pace. But the disparity didn't. In the skies, the numbers were even more lopsided. Germany, fighting a multi-front war and under relentless Allied bombing, built 20,600 aircraft in 1943. The United States, meanwhile, manufactured an astonishing 85,898 planes. We're talking about a 4-to-1 advantage, and those American planes, P-51 Mustangs, B-17 Flying Fortresses, P-47 Thunderbolts, were not only numerous but increasingly sophisticated and deadly. For every German fighter trying to defend the Reich, 4 Allied aircraft were being built to join the sky battle. These weren't just abstract figures on a spreadsheet. These were the weapons that directly translated into Allied air superiority, massive armored formations, and a logistical lifeline that ensured troops on the ground never ran out of what they needed. The German analysts understood that every PZ KPFW IV they built was instantly outnumbered by multiple Shermans, and every Messerschmitt Bf 109 found itself facing a swarm of Allied fighters. This massive, unchecked American war machine wasn't just catching up, it was accelerating past Germany at an impossible speed. And as if that wasn't enough, there was another, equally vital piece of the puzzle that German intelligence was forced to confront. The battle for the Atlantic was being irrevocably. If the endless tanks and planes weren't enough to induce dread, German naval intelligence was about to get an even more gut-punching reality check: the so-called Liberty Ship Revolution. For much of the early war, Germany effectively waged a vital U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, sinking Allied shipping at alarming rates, threatening to strangle Britain and choke off the lifeline to Europe. But American ingenuity, combined with that boundless industrial capacity, turned the tide in a way no amount of tactical submarine warfare could counter. The key was the Liberty ship, a 10,000-ton cargo vessel, simple in design but revolutionary in its construction. American shipyards, led by figures like Henry Kaiser, perfected prefabrication and welding techniques that allowed these ships to be built with astonishing speed. Initially, a Liberty ship might take a few months. There were instances where a Liberty ship was launched in just 4 days. While that was the extreme record, producing one in 10 to 14 days became commonplace. They were literally building 3 of these massive cargo ships every single day. Let's crunch those numbers. In 1943 alone, America launched an unbelievable 19.2 million tons of shipping. To put that in perspective, the entire German U-boat fleet, operating at maximum effectiveness and taking heavy losses itself, managed to sink only 2.6 million tons of Allied shipping in that same year. Do you see the problem? America was building ships at 7 times the rate U-boats could sink them. 7 to 1. This wasn't merely a defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic. No matter how many brave U-boat crews sailed, no matter how many Allied ships they managed to torpedo, the Americans were bringing exponentially more tonnage online. Germany's entire naval strategy, its hope of isolating Britain, of preventing the build-up for an invasion of Europe, became utterly, unequivocally impossible. The ocean was no longer a barrier. It was a highway, and America was paving it faster than Germany could lay mines. This realization, perhaps more than any other, stripped away any lingering hope of victory. The war was lost not just on land or in the air, but on the relentless assembly lines of America's shipyards. All right, if you want to understand the true backbone of industrial warfare, you have to look at the basics: steel and fuel. And here, the numbers for German intelligence were not just bad, they were mind-numbing. In 1943, the United States was a colossus of raw material production, pumping out an astonishing 81 million tons of steel. Germany, for all its industrial might and wartime frenzy, managed only 30 million tons. That's nearly a 3-to-1 advantage in the fundamental building block of every tank, every ship, every gun barrel. If you can't make the steel, you can't make the war machine. But steel, massive as the disparity was, wasn't even that belonged to oil. The lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare, fuel was the constant, gnawing anxiety for every German commander. Their war machine ran on fumes. America. In 1943, the US produced an astounding 1.4 billion barrels of oil. Germany, facing a desperate hunt for synthetic fuel and access to Romanian oil fields, managed a meager 40 to 50 million barrels. That's a 28-to-1 advantage, conservatively speaking. Think about the implications on the battlefield. While German panzer divisions literally seized fuel from captured dumps or were forced to halt due to empty tanks, American units operated with what to German eyes was seemingly limitless fuel. There are countless anecdotes from German POWs and intelligence, reports detailing American units firing up idling engines for hours just to keep warm or abandoning vehicles with a half-full tank of gas, rather than risking a retrieval mission. What a German officer would consider criminal negligence, the wasteful use of irreplaceable resources, was standard, efficient practice for the Americans. The strategic value of time, maneuverability, and morale often outweighed the cost of fuel for them. This wasn't just about winning battles, it was about the fundamental capacity to wage war. Without steel, you can't make the weapons. Without oil, the weapons can't move. These raw material statistics formed the grim foundation upon which the German analysts built their ultimate, devastating conclusion. They saw the overwhelming numbers and realized that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome a foe who practically swam in steel and fuel. This wasn't a fair fight. It was a... So by December 1943, armed with an unassailable mountain of evidence, the captured supply charts, the POW interrogations, the production figures for tanks, planes, ships, steel and oil, Colonels Gehlen, von Röhroner, and other German intelligence analysts compiled a comprehensive report. This wasn't some minor memo. This was a detailed, meticulously sourced document laying out the undeniable truth. Germany could not win the war. The numbers simply didn't add up. They presented this mathematical reality to Hitler and the High Command, believing that surely, confronted with such irrefutable evidence, strategic adjustments would be made. Yet what happened next was perhaps one of the most tragic, and Hitler, alongside most of his inner circle and senior generals, utterly dismissed the report. They branded it as defeatist propaganda, an insult to German fighting spirit, and a product of weak-minded bureaucrats. How could they, the architects of Blitzkrieg, the masters of tactical superiority, be outmaneuvered by mere factory output? They believed that sheer willpower, revolutionary tactics, and the promise of secret weapons, the V-rockets, jet fighters, and other Wunderwaffen, would somehow overcome the devastating, undeniable. For Hitler, the war was a test of wills, not a balance sheet. He refused to accept the cold, hard industrial reality that America had built a war machine beyond anything he had ever imagined. His worldview was steeped in social Darwinism and racial superiority, where German valor and ingenuity would always triumph over the decadent West. To admit that raw production capacity mattered more than Aryan might was to undermine the very foundations of his idea. This wasn't just a misinterpretation of intelligence. It was a wholesale rejection of reality, a descent into an ideological fantasy world. The men who had calculated Germany's doom with such precision were ignored, marginalized, or worse. The consequences of this monumental hubris, this willful blindness, would be absolutely terrifying, leading to an extension of the war that would cost millions more lives and plunge Germany into utter devastation. The bitter irony is that the very intelligence officers who saw the light were... And so the greatest tragedy unfolded. Despite the irrefutable evidence presented to them in December 1943, Germany's leadership plunged headfirst into 18 more months of agonizing, unnecessary warfare. Millions more lives would be extinguished, cities reduced to rubble, and an entire nation pushed to the brink of total annihilation, all for an outcome that was, by then, mathematically certain. The analysts had laid bare the simple, grim truth. Germany was fighting a five-front war against the Soviets in the east, the British and Americans moving through Italy, the Allied bombing offensive in the skies, the naval blockade, and the looming threat of the Western invasion, all with approximately one-fifth the steel production. Think about that for a moment. Every tank, every plane, every shell, every truck, built and supplied by the Allies was being produced at a rate Germany could only dream of. How do you win a war of industrial attrition when your opponent can field 3, 5, even 10 times more equipment than you can? No amount of tactical skill, no single general's genius, no desperate courage from individual soldiers could overcome such... This wasn't a game of chess where one brilliant move could turn the tide. It was a grinder, and Germany was simply out of material to feed into it. The lesson here is brutal but clear. In the crucible of modern industrial warfare, factories matter more than courage, and production lines determine outcomes more than individual valor. The heroic last stands, the desperate counterattacks, the miracle weapon promises, they were all rendered moot by the relentless roar of American production. The story of those German analysts, bravely presenting an inconvenient truth to a leadership trapped in ideological fantasy, serves as a stark, enduring, accurate intelligence, no matter how meticulously gathered or painfully evident, is utterly worthless if leadership refuses to accept the mathematical reality it uncovers. And when that reality is ignored, the consequences cease to be merely strategic. They become catastrophic, costing not just battles, but entire generations. What a chilling reminder that sometimes the most profound truths are found not in heroic narratives, but in the cold,